Hello everybody, thanks for coming. My name is Danny Denton, and I have the pleasure and the privilege of introducing you to Megan, Nolan and Nicole Flattery, and we're going to hear from them. Hear them read from the books first, and then I've got about 5 pages of questions which I'll have to try and truncate. But loads of questions, and we would love to hear questions from you as well towards the end. So if you'll indulge me, I just want to read a little introduction to their brilliant books. And I should add, the books are for sale, and they're happy to sign books afterwards in the room, you'll see it when you come out, but it's just the room next to us here. So Megan Nolan is a writer from Waterford and is the author of 2 novels, Acts of Desperation, and the book we'll hear from today, Ordinary Human Failings. Her essays and reviews have also featured in the pages of the New York Times, the White Review, the Guardian and Frieze, among others. Acts of Desperation was the recipient of a Betty Trask Award, shortlisted for the Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year Award, and longlisted for the Dylan Thomas Prize. In Ordinary Human Failings, published, I think it's published next week, but we do have copies available, which is kind of nice. It is May 1990 in London. A child on a council estate goes missing and is later found dead. Suspicions on the estate are immediately rife and investigations begun, and the focus of everybody's glare is a young Irish girl named Lucy Green, and indeed her reclusive family. An ambitious tabloid journalist named Tom hones in on the family, hell-bent on being the first to break the story of the family's evil core, the despicable secret out of which this grave act has ebbed. But of course it's not that simple, or so black and white. And thus, while Ordinary Human Failings has a compelling plot, what actually happened to the child, it feels to me more like a portrait of a family. And in fact, it's a remarkable book about this family, John, Rose, Carmel, Richie, and Lucy Green, who constantly, in the novel, I would say, maybe fail each other, and yet they hang in there together. It seems often that they don't know how to love one another, but in another sense, they continue to try to love one another, or at least can't let each other go. The ordinary human failings in the book are ordinary in the sense that they're failings we all contend with a lot of the time. And it felt to me like the story of all families, certainly my family. And funnily enough, that makes it an extraordinary book, because it tells you that by failing, in fact, you're human, which 12:30 on a Sunday, but this is not mass. It's a book in which every character feels like the protagonist, even a teacher called Miss Dillon, who appears for 2 pages. It is a book about how we encounter stories, how we tell them, how we forge them, and often exploit them. It is utterly vivid and written with disarming, unsettling honesty, and is absolutely devastating in moments. In Nicole Flattery's new novel, Nothing Special, we spend most of our time in New York City in 1966, in Andy Warhol's notorious factory, where 17-year-old May has been hired as a typist who, along with her new counterpart Shelley, will transcribe Andy Warhol's novel, well, his notes for his novel, I suppose, A. Warhol's project is to record the conversations of his factory collaborators and disciples, and to produce an unconventional work of art in book form. As one of the mediums for this experiment, May seems caught between 2 worlds, that of art and celebrity and partying, and that of the meager apartment she lives in with her alcoholic mother and her mother's on-off boyfriend, Mikey. And caught in this way, her desire for inner change, to become someone, gets increasingly conflicted until, to me anyway, she almost seems to disappear into the tape she's transcribing, the typewriter becoming this kind of totem. Nicole's first book, the short story collection Show Them a Good Time, won the London Magazine Prize for Debut Fiction and the Kate O'Brien Award. Elsewhere, her work has been published in the London Review of Books, The Stinging Fly, the White Review, Dublin Review, New York Times, Sight and Sound magazine, and Winter Papers. As a long-time admirer of Nicole's work, it's been such a thrill watching someone whose stories are so original stretch their ideas and their characters out into the novel form. It's a superb, unique, complex novel. Again, in my reading of it, it's about friendship, it's about art, it's about celebrity, I think, and social media, and it's about seeking change and seeking purpose and the desire maybe to know yourself, but also the desire to be known, to be seen and heard and acknowledged, for better or for worse. can you just give a round of applause to Megan, please? So Megan, I think you're going to read first, and then we'll hear from Nicole, and then I'll...
So I'll just give a little bit of context for this. So the character I'm going to read about is Richie, who is the brother of Carmel, who's the mother of Lucy, who's the child accused of the crime. And Richie, at the point we meet him now, so I'm going to read from the present of the novel is 1990 in London, and some of it is set in a hotel, so that's the first part, and then we kind of go back a little bit in time to his life in Waterford in the past. Okay. So this is 1990. A knock jolted Richie into the physical agony of panic his mind had been trying to protect him from. He had noticed a few years back that of the hours you would describe as sleep, those hours he was in bed with eyes closed, several of them were no longer really unconscious. The final hour or two before he actually left bed were spent in a suspended state, through which the aware part of himself urged the still asleep part not to wake. The aware part was guardian, feeling no anxiety itself, but knowing that when it was met by the absented full consciousness, then it would all come crashing down. The aware part soothed the other when it began reaching towards cognition, assured it that it was fine to stay in the sleeping state a while longer, where nothing could hurt it. "You're okay, you're okay, you're okay," said the aware part. Sometimes it repeated Richie's personal self-soothing mantra, which was an affirmation he had once seen written out for a bold boy in his class at school, who had terrible weeping explosions and, as a result, no friends. A teacher had written on a sticker for him and fixed it to his homework diary, for him to look at and repeat when he was upset. "I'm a good person, and other people think so too." And Richie's aware part said this to the other part, to calm it down while it struggled towards the new day. Today, though, there had not been a lengthy transition period, the knock coming just after 8 o'clock, and the shock of this new day was far worse than the usual badness of those at home. His mind strained to make sense of his big white bed and the quality of sunlight coming through the window, and then, once it had caught up, rejected the ostensible pleasantness of these things as the signals of terror they were. He recalled dimly hissing at his sister and father in the bar, memory on either side of that scene. He tried to think if he had spoken any more, praying he had not invited the journalist into his room. Clambering out of bed, he paused a moment and pressed with expertly calculated pressure on the tender right side of his lower torso, which pained him as it did most mornings. Outside the door, a bag had been discreetly left with a note on top, reading, "I'll let you have something to eat and meet you back here in a while for the hair of the dog, Tom." The bag contained 3 new pairs of boxers and socks, a blue cotton shirt, 3 plain t-shirts, and a pair of strange elasticated slacks, all from Marks & Spencer. He wondered if his father had received an identical package, and if not, how the person tasked with choosing the items had made their decisions. He would wear his black jeans as usual, the same pair he had had for 10 years, the weight gain since then all localized above where they sat on his body. He also had with him an old dark green knitted jumper that had belonged to Rose, inherited from her own father, a huge ratty garment full of moth holes he had assimilated into the incoherent punk-adjacent aesthetic of his early 20s. He had dressed that way when his life had frozen in its place without him being aware that it was happening, so that he still dressed now, at 32, like he had been waylaid en route to a gig in a filthy basement. There were some days he woke up and tried not to drink, and contrary to people's beliefs, there were even some days when he did not drink. They were rare now, but there were a few a month. Sometimes because an ailment was alarming him, sometimes because he was awash with depression and shame and couldn't bear the idea of leaving the flat to get more, sometimes because he hadn't the money, and very occasionally because he convinced himself he might try to give up again. There was a time in his drinking when he went day on, day off. It meant that during the on days he would drink enough to make sure he would feel too sick to want it the next day, and this meant he was only drinking 4 nights a week, which wasn't much more than a lot of people his age at the time. It seemed like a sufficient negotiation to make with the world, one of many he tried to strike with his drinking. That system lasted a while until he had been in London a year, and it became clear that the fresh start had been no such thing, and none of his attempts to make a life for himself had been or were going to be successful. The need for days off stopped seeming so apparent when he hadn't shifts to work or interviews to do. So now he would just drink a normal amount every day, but not to that extreme degree he had before. And this was true until it wasn't. Until one day he was drinking with the purposeful excess of the old on days, and every day was now an on day. There were some days he woke up and tried not to drink still, but this day, waking in the alien hotel room light, was not one of them. And then I'll just go a little bit. This is back in his life in Waterford, and he's briefly found a job that he likes in a restaurant, and then this is the aftermath of him kind of destroying that situation. In the moment before waking, his body was already laden with expansive dread, knowing more than he did. The top part of his chest was so heavy and dense with fright and sorrow that he felt sure he would scream. His pulse thumped disturbingly, erratically, and he put his hand to his throat to touch it and push it back inside of himself. There were too many bad things to think of, and he told himself to be calm and slow. But it was no use, and he sat up on the couch where he lay and put his head in his hands and cried for a few moments. There were two bodies on the other side of the room, but they were still, and he didn't wake them with his noises. He needed to know what time it was, but he also badly did not want to know. He would have chosen to remain in his brief suspension if it held any comfort at all, or the possibility of returning to sleep, but there was no way to move but forward now, the ignorance as excruciating as the truth would be. He turned on the radio to a low volume and waited until he heard what time it was, just after midday. Some of the worst of the alarm had left his body as soon as he knew how bad it really was, and that nothing could now be salvaged. The lunch party would be arriving, he thought. He hoped that when Bella had come in, it had not been so bad that she would have to close for the whole day. He thought of her having to clean up after him. He thought about how much money it might be now that he now owed to her. At least the others would help with that. They weren't the worst. It wasn't their fault. It was him. He was the one with the key, the one with the responsibility. He cringed to think of Lucienne and their conversation as they broke in, their chummy familiarity in the dead of night. He wondered about the parts he didn't remember. He rubbed his thumb under his eyes and over his cheeks, which he felt to be hot, and with the small raised bumps beneath the surface which sometimes came. He knew there was no choice but to go there to the restaurant before he sobered up completely and lost his nerve and would hide from it forever. There were the keys to return, and he would have to do that or else she would be frightened. He would come back again, and she would need to get the locks changed. The idea of himself as a person to be frightened of was so wrong and obscene, and yet he had to credit it. He could imagine how she would feel after this because it was how he felt too. He had never felt scared of himself before, that he was a suspect person who couldn't be predicted. He had been sick in the gardens of his friends' parents' houses or kissed girls he wished he hadn't. He had been embarrassed, but he'd never experienced this depth of shame and total bewilderment at his own actions. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. Now I invite Nicole to read. Thank you, Megan.
Thanks, Danny, for that lovely introduction, and thank you. I'm going to read from the third chapter of this book, and in this chapter, May is older, and she's gone back to New York, and she runs into a friend of hers, and they go for lunch. Sometimes over the years, I said things that were alien to me, alien and old-fashioned, and I thought, or I said aloud, I sound like Maud. It was mostly when I was being brattish or desperate. When Maud left a voicemail on my phone, she obviously sounded less juvenile, more assured. But still, no matter how wooden and formal her intonation, her younger self slipped through. Your voice always betrays you, the pained inhales, the exhales, the hesitations, the momentary wobbles. She wanted to meet. She'd love to meet. Her girlfriends these days were busy. I wondered when everyone got girlfriends, all those trusting friendships, and where was I? I thought of the television show, the sweet way the women collectively treated catastrophe, their photogenic days out. I'd once had a friendship that deep, but with none of those beats or moments. I'd once had a friendship that disarranged my life. I entertained some new and ridiculous ideas. Maud and I designer shopping, Maud and I licking icing off cupcakes in a Lust City park. It was her nervousness on the voicemail that endeared me to her, made me forgive her pre-dedication for the Whitney gift shop, forgive her new face. I was no longer interested in punishing people anyway. I called her back and agreed. I let her choose everything. I knew she'd like that. I could see us in a restaurant window, just two of a million women lunching in New York City, taking a competitive record of each other's lives. The place was tucked away. If I hadn't spotted Maud in the window, shyly moving the cutlery back and forth, I might not have found it. When I entered, she stood up and greeted me with a kiss on each cheek. Her perfume was the same as the one my mother used to wear. I knew this kind of greeting, to my mind so awkward and forced, barely registered with her. Our table was covered with a white tablecloth. I wanted to take an inventory of everything, the flowers, the waitstaff, the 2 sets of hands resting on the table, one with a wedding ring, one without. I felt like I was on vacation, entering a foreign country where for my own safety I had to register new details. The restaurant was filled with mostly young patrons issuing dispatches from their lives. It was a Saturday morning, so many were dishevelled, recovering from the night before. They were all uniformly attractive in a forgettable way. I recognized how they held themselves, as if they were already famous or as if fame was only a phone call away. From the speaker came the low, folksy tones of Joni Mitchell. "Joni," I said dumbly to Maud as a greeting. "It's Joni Mitchell." She nodded. "Reminds me of being a sad woman." "I still have all her records," I said. It was the kind of embarrassing teenage admission that I thought might put us at ease. "Preparing for hard times, romantically." "Romantically, the hard times never left," I said. "You know my problem, Maud. Men could never resist me." Maud nodded and smiled provisionally, like the conversation was moving in an unplanned direction. Her face was serious in a way I didn't remember it being, almost religious, as if lunch were an activity she undertook with great gravity. Around us, the diners paid no attention to Joni's ramblings about love and self-degradation. The music was only blurry background noise to them. They'd heard it somewhere before, knew a recycled version distorted through the years. In front of me, Maud moved her hands energetically, talking about her husband William, the latest exhibitions, what hotels I stayed in when I came to New York, the total lack of crime now, the excellent food, the latest good novels, the relative lack of crime now, the culinary imagination of a lot of local bistros. Maud talked a lot. That was still one of her traits. She lowered her voice, perhaps not consciously, when she asked about where I live now, as if I had descended from a mountain, as if I was a fugitive. She signaled to the waiter, who had occurred to me only when she ordered our salad. She knew. They exchanged mild, flirtatious glances. A flush rose on Maud's neck, but the waiter remained professional. The sexual tension was all part of the service. The staff were all chillingly attractive too. Maybe there wasn't a single ugly, clumsy person left in New York. Our salads were given to us in large glass bowls. They were huge and decorative, like a picture of a salad you might show a child to make a point. It was so ceremonial, I didn't know where to start. I plunged haphazardly inside and pulled out a strange sort of radish. "What's this?" I asked, interrupting Maud's monologue. "I don't know if I've ever seen one of these before." "You were always curious, May." She paused, "to your detriment." "What is it, though?" Maud rummaged in her salad and emerged with a similar radish, only longer and more humorously purple. She examined it. "I don't know," she said, as if conceding a larger defeat. "Don't tell them," I said, gesturing at the door where the waitstaff emerged and disappeared. "They'll only worry." She laughed, covering her mouth. I'd forgotten that Maud, underneath her prudishness, had a good sense of humour. There had once been something that drew us together. We had giggled a lot as girls, leaning on each other's shoulders, weak with hilarity. I reminded myself that whatever habits she'd acquired in adulthood were probably like mine, to stave off loneliness. I reached across and squeezed her hand. "So good to see you," I said. She snorted. "What's left of me?" Her nose was noticeably thinner, her forehead stretched and thawed, her lips plumper. All those changes had only made her look more fragile. "You look good," I said. "Fact is," she said, "every woman like me has a doctor." She kept looking around as if expecting the waiter to return so they could resume their relationship. "William pays. You didn't get married then?" I shook my head. "There was someone a little while ago, but, she said expectantly. "But I guess what I liked about him was how badly he treated me." "I get that," Maud said. "I totally get that." Was this what I had been missing? Friendship? Having my worst, basest desires confirmed as expensive dogs bounced up and down the sidewalk outside. I was hit all at once by a feeling that felt close to happiness. I liked it here. I liked how people talk so openly. I liked the woman sitting opposite me with a forkful of salad. "Love can be very slippery," I said.
Thank you both. It's hard to figure out where to start. I literally have 6 pages, I think, of questions. 2 brilliant books. Nothing Special has been out a while, and this is fresh. How do you feel about a book when you're done with it? What's your relationship with it like now that it's done and out in the world?
This one, because a lot of it is so Waterford, I feel like more. It feels very like continuous to me. Like I went to Waterford this week, and being there with it felt really great, actually. And I think because the characters are Waterford people, they just, I don't know, it all feels very alive to me still. Was my first book, I think, because it was obviously quite a claustrophobic, like interior novel. I was very, very sick of it as soon as I was finished, and never wanted to think about it again. And then spent the last 2 years thinking about it. But I don't know. I felt very done with that. I suppose, with the first one, I sort of almost purposely wrote it as a catharsis of a certain kind of writing that I had been engaged in, like confessional and personal writing or whatever. And I sort of went as hard as I could into that purposefully to get sick of it so I could stop doing it almost. And then this is a different thing, and it's like more, it's closer to like the sort of thing that I've always liked to read, I suppose. So I feel a little bit more friendlier towards it than I felt towards the other one.
Yeah, that's interesting actually, because I did kind of know. I was like, oh, this is quite different, you know, and that's fine. Writers can write different books, but it's interesting to know that was like an intentional thing from the start, like that I'm going to do something kind of different. And what about you, Nicole? Like it's been out a little bit longer.
It has, yeah. I think I feel a little bit the way you felt about your first book, because this is a very claustrophobic book, and people keep asking me about Warhol. I'm like, I don't know. I'm not sure. So I think
can throw away 2 pages of questions now.
No, you can ask. But I am excited. I'm working on something new. And I don't know if Megan has a similar impulse, but I think there is this feeling with every book you want to kill the last book almost, you know? So you want to do something different, and my new book is hopefully doing something a little different. But yeah, like it's been great. I like talking about it.
And now I'm not going to bang on about Warhol now, but I'm interested to know, because my kind of next question really is like, how did these books kind of come about? What was the early thing? Was it a character or a story, or was it like an intention to do something more expansive or something than the interiority of the first one? What, like, did you say, I want to write a novel about this book, this time, this person, or?
Initially, the idea came from. So I read A Lonely City by Olivia Lang years ago, like even before the stories were published, maybe when I was like 26 or 27. And I still have the little piece of paper I wrote the idea down on, because I read about a novel, which is a book that Andy Warhol he followed his people around with a tape recorder for a while, and then got typists to type it up. And I thought that the initial idea came from the idea of working on something creative and then not having your name on it, which I thought was like a very sad idea. Because, I could write the worst book in the world, but I would still feel like it's mine, And then I wanted to kind of explore that more than look at the factory stuff. But as I researched it, and the research took like a year or whatever, I never got bored of it. It would still remained interesting to me. So that was good. Yeah.
Was the how does because I've never really researched a book. How does it? Did you do loads and loads of research and then put it all aside and go, now I'm going to write my book, or was it kind of back and forth? Was it hard? Because one really cool thing about this book is Warhol. I don't think he ever gets named. He certainly doesn't get named much, and he doesn't really appear until page, I think it's 105.
Yeah.
And was there was it hard to do that, or was it easy because you knew what you wanted to do?
Well, I think the problem with something like Warhol is when you put a character like that in a novel, like it's going to overpower the novel. And I never wanted it to be like a book about Warhol. That wasn't my intention. It's about the girls that typed up the tapes. Yeah. So I knew I read so much about it. I was reading all the time, and actually I spoke to Kevin Barry, who wrote that book about John Lennon, and he was like, "Are you still researching?" And I was like, "Yeah, I have to do a lot of research." He was like, "Stop. Yeah. I know you're using it to waste time, to procrastinate." And that was useful. I was like, "Okay, I'm going to put it aside now." But the thing about the research is I didn't want it to be the sort of historical novel where things are perfect and you can tell I did all this research. I actually don't enjoy reading that. Where someone does a lot of research and they put in a paragraph because they're like, I don't want to have wasted my research. But I wanted the book to have a sort of unconscious. So everything that I was reading about him and his ideas and stuff, I feel like they're all in there, but not in a way that's hugely signposted.
Yeah. And it absolutely one of the brilliant consequences of that approach as well is, like, it feels it sounds kind of glib to say it, but I think it's true, so I have to say it anyway. Like, I almost forget I'm reading a book set in 1966 for a large part of it, because, like, say the restaurants you're not trying to input, like, oh, that was the day something happened, you know, like, that was the day they were landing on the moon, kind of, you know. It's literally like places don't really have fixed names. Like, the factory is the factory, and that's owned or whatever, but it's not. It's not bogged down by these kind of factual details, and so it like. I think I'm about halfway. When I'm about halfway through it, I'm thinking, oh, this is a novel about today. This is like being alive today. It's a really nice side effect of it. I'm curious, Megan. I was really happy to hear you read Richie, because I was fighting back the tears for Richie a lot of the time in this book. How did this one come about? Like, you set out to do something different, or something that more inclined with what you liked to read? Were there characters at the start of it, or an idea?
So no, I was relieved that what idea did come to me was so different from the first one, but I didn't strategize and think like, I want to write a different thing now. I just had this chance encounter with an anecdote in. This has been 5 years ago, before the first one came out. I read this book called Somebody's Husband, Somebody's Son, which is a Gordon Byrne book. He's a Scottish writer. He's a novelist as well, but he wrote these incredible, I suppose you call them true crime, but much better than that implies or whatever. Really great books. And he wrote this book called Somebody's Husband, Somebody's Son about Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper. And there was just a very throwaway anecdote in that, in the book, where it said that a tabloid journalist had approached Sutcliffe's family, and many of whom were working class alcoholics, and he had said, come into this hotel and you can have a load of booze and, you know, a bit of pocket money, and you'll basically implied that we'll sequester you in exchange for you being just our source and nobody else's. I don't actually know if that ever took place in reality, but I know that someone offered them that. So that was just that was the idea then, was like this idea of the hotel and the pressure cooker that would be in this like moment of extreme anguish for the whole family, and that was it really. But then I was very glad to have the chance to do a family novel, because as you said in your introduction, I think that is what it is primarily. Obviously, it has some of the mechanisms of a thriller in some ways, but mostly for me, it's the family is the main core of it.
Yeah, that's really well put together. Like that. That was one of my questions: was, does that actually happen? So it was proposed that it would happen. That he gets the family into this hotel. They're each in a different room, and it almost feels like it's not interview format, but it feels like we're going to hear Richie's story, John's story, Carmel's story, and God, it's like you go really deep. Was it a hard book to write? Like, because I have told these two lines. Like, being a writer myself, I always say writing is just a job. It's just a job, 9 to 5, like anything. But there is one lie about that, is that when you're writing stuff, you are kind of living it too. Like, so you write something quite traumatic, you feel unsettled by it. Was it a difficult book to write in that sense, or? In
parts, there's a couple. Like the Richie stuff upset me to write, and I had an uncle who was an alcoholic who had died very recently when I was writing that, and I found that really physically tough to like sit down to every day when something was happening in my own life. And then the pregnancy stuff really upset me to write as well, because my mum spent a lot of her life like campaigning around abortion repeal, and it's just something that's like been an active concern in my family for a long time, and something that we like, that has been a part of my life for a long time. And so I write about an unwanted pregnancy in Ireland in the 70s, and I found that really upsetting to write.
Yeah, upsetting to read as well, because like when we say an unwanted pregnancy, she really doesn't want it. It's fantastic. Well, fantastic is probably the wrong word. Really devastating.
Absolutely brilliant.
But just so like one of the things I think about these two books is like, because, and again, this sounds kind of reductive, but like they're so good on just what it's like to be alive, to live through things, you know. And there's one kind of interesting confluence is May looks at her mother, who is also an alcoholic and kind of works in a diner, and May really doesn't want that life for herself. And there's a point at which, I can't remember if it's the mother quotes it or something, or if May just observes it, but for May's mother, it's about getting through. Life is about survival, about getting through. And there's a moment in which Rose, who's Carmel's mother, I think, says to Carmel, well, we'll get through. Oh no, Rose says to her sister, we're going to get through the pregnancy, and then I'll get through this, and the sister's like, and what are you going to get through after that? Like again, like life is just getting through things for you. Is there any hope?
Generally, for all of us, or in the book?
No. But then to counterbalance that, one of the really beautiful things in the book is they both are really good, sparsely, on human connection. So really lovely book about friendship. And there's the friendship between, like the scene you read, Maud and May, they kind of fail to connect, but even in failing to connect, they connect. And certainly, like Richie and Carmel's most lovely moments are connecting. And John, the dad, who's very quiet and kind of aloof maybe throughout the book, there's a bit of connection towards, and he says something to Carmel that becomes really important. Was there a sense of like trying to get from disconnection to connection, or is that just a natural? Did that just come out of the books?
Yeah, for me, I always had this sense about I won't obviously say what the ending is, but there's a moment where a connection is slowly being established that has seemed impossible until this point, and yeah, I sort of knew I wanted to end on that note because it is quite a grim book, and it is about people who have found it impossible to be in each other's orbits, trying to, impossibly trying to break those barriers with each other and failing over and over again. But I didn't want to end on that note, and like it's not how I feel about the world either. I think speech and communication is incredibly difficult within a family, and like even though I'm really close to my family, sometimes I'm shocked by the physical, like how difficult physically I find it to speak about certain things with them, because you get into these roles that have been established for decades, and then it's kind of hard to shatter those. And so, yeah, I wanted to portray it, how difficult that can be, but also, the change is possible, and I do believe that. And I think, no matter how old a relationship is, I think there's possibilities within relationships as long as they exist, basically. And yes, I definitely had a desire to end on that note. Yeah.
There's a beautiful. It's not a spoiler, but I kind of want to hint at something. There's this beautiful observation at one point about the way the family eat. The dad horses into food. Which my dad, who's not here, I can say also does that. And there's a link to that actually it's an ancestral habit. And there's this tiny little change at the end that feels so profound, and I won't spoil what it is. But those little moments felt like, redemption is probably not the right word, but just this gave me this really warm sense of well-being and hope. And Nicole, were you writing was the friendship thing very conscious in your writing of the book, or did it kind of arise out of...
Thinking of hope. Just thinking about how to get some hope. I really wanted to write about ambition, and this, the factory was a place of such ambition, and kind of wasted ambition. There was a lot of tragedy and stuff. And May and Shelley both see these tapes and their kind of entrance into this life as to take them away from who they were. I think there's even a line I could destroy the person I had been by doing this, and I think that kind of and then even looking at the trajectory of the factory, the section that I'm writing about, the 60s, that was when it was at its kind of creative peak, and the people that were there, they were really friends. I do believe they were really friends, and then things really changed as Warhol became a brand in the 70s and 80s. It became a different thing. So I was kind of thinking a lot about how ambition can just change your relationship with other people, and change your friendships, and change your relationship with yourself, and how it actually becomes harder to have those connections as you start desiring more kind of things. And I really feel the end of the book it's set a little bit in the future, and it's been read so differently by so many people, but it's not a spoiler to be May doesn't have this great artistic career, and some people have been to me, oh, it's really sad. It's really sad that she's like this. I'm it's not. She still maintains who she is, and I think even contacting her mother, ruining the whole book, contacting her mother by the end of the book is a sign of that she's still willing to seek out those connections that hasn't been, she hasn't transformed into this different version of herself. But that's the way I was kind of looking at how to.
Yeah, I found it a wonderfully hopeful ending in terms of. Am I right in thinking it ends? She's going in to see Mikey, and Mikey's a really interesting, in the book. Maybe I'm just a male wanting to champion another male or something, but he feels a little bit like a hero because he's always there. He doesn't disappear, and he doesn't seem to have any ambition whatsoever. Like he has a quote about like, working is a waste of time. Like, what are you doing? But the conversation she has with Mike, like there's conversations and connections with Shelley. The one with Maud, I think, is really interesting because it's kind of a failure, but I found it really moving anyway. But then there's Mikey, and at the end, she's going back towards a family in a sense, like, isn't she?
Yeah, I was thinking of Mikey as like I was thinking of lots of doubles in the book, and like to me, Mikey is like Warhol's double because he is, you know, creative and artistic, and he has all these ideas, and he shows Maeve like these films and gives her books and things, but he doesn't have the access that Warhol has. He doesn't have the friends. He doesn't have the connections and things. So I was thinking of him. He's like the moral center of the book, you know, in some ways. He's my favorite character.
Yeah, he's
yeah. There's actually, I do want to if I can find it. There's a Warhol quote that I want to give you, and then just because it's a way of continuing that conversation. Warhol said of the project a novel, the acquisition of my tape recorder really finished whatever emotional life I might have had, but I was glad to see it go. As in, I was glad to see the emotional life go.
So that was a quote I had in the book. I went like the epigraph, whatever, and it was in the proof, and I couldn't afford it.
So
from the Warhol estate, they wouldn't give it to me. Yeah. Too pricey.
But there's something really interesting about that. Like the book does feel like a comment on that made in the end. She has almost seems to have the choice of letting the emotional life go, and she turns away from it, even though she does almost lose herself in the tapes. Like, but a difference between Mikey and Warhol for me it seems like Mikey knows about the emotional life, and that's why he sticks around for May's mother. Well, maybe he's not sticking around for her. Maybe he just can't find a way to leave. Maybe she's desperate for him to leave. I don't know. But there's a really interesting thing happening in the factory in that sense that people are all there to kind of turn their life into art, or for him to turn their life into art. And that feels really exploitative and increasingly creepy as the book goes on.
Yeah. It definitely, like I've spoke about this, you know, and there is a line in the book where it's Mikey who says it, you know, like following your friends around with a tape recorder is seen as like a fun thing to kind of do, and you know, turn their like lives into art, but it's also surveillance. Like, you know, you're going back and you're reading everything, and what did they say about me and things. It is sort of creepy, and that whole kind of method of turning. Of like what he did to people, did he use them and like make them famous, or did he exploit them? And I read so much about this, and I still couldn't decide, you know, in many ways. But what I really liked writing about Mikey in comparison to the people in the factory, and I think you write similar kind of characters, Megan, where it's like you just can't. They're not canny enough. Like they're not like able to like ease into life in the same way. They just kind of lack that little thing, and they're my favorite kind of characters to write. And I think you write in that book. You write them really beautifully as well.
You both write like really rich, complex characters, and I actually find that a lot of books veer away from that these days. That they try. There's maybe it's because we see it a lot in movies and things, that there's a black and whiteness to a lot of things these days, where this is the baddie, this is the goodie. And actually we were talking at Clara Kumagai's event yesterday about the Ghibli films. And one of the lovely things about the Ghibli films is the baddies are never really fully baddies. Actually, you get to see things from their point of view. And there's no... I judged Warhol and Tom actually quite cynically. But everyone else, there is this... in those two, but there is this complexity that you can't judge them one way or the other. Is that a thing that you kind of, when you're writing, you're going, I'm going to make sure, like, oh, they've been really sound for 10 pages. I've got to chuck in them being a bollocks here for me. Are you consciously crafting that kind of complexity, or is it just a result of the way you view the world and it just comes out, do you think?
Usually it's as a result of like me happening to notice in a person in actual life something that shocks me, and I think, oh, why are you so shocked by that? So in Tom's case, I had been doing shifts in in a newspaper in London called the Metro. It's like a daily free sheet, and they shared an office building with the Daily Mail and loads of other tabloids. And then, so you would, encounter the journalists from there sometimes, and then we had a kind of joint training day. So I was in this room with 10 other new Daily Mail people, and my perception of tabloid journalists was that they're evil, basically, and especially because I had like a long-standing interest in like British tabloid history, and I had read loads of memoirs, like very unrepentant memoirs by tabloid journalists who had done really horrific things. And so I went into this room really feeling like, antagonistic, and like I didn't want to be in that room, and it wasn't good to be in that room. But I did meet this boy who was sort of he's not like Tom, because the guy in real life was more sweet and more naive than Tom is. But he was this really, really lovely, very young, like 20 years old, from the provinces. He'd just arrived to London 2 days before, really like, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. And he was just lovely, and I thought, like, he's going to either he's going to be bad, or he won't succeed because he won't allow himself to be. And I don't mean, like, I know everyone who works for a tabloid is not evil, obviously, but I just had this feeling of, like, oh, God, that's how it happens. Like, the people who do end up doing horrendous things, they don't always start off going like, all right, time to start my job and become evil. And they probably, a lot of them start out just wanting to do a good job and loving newspapers. And so, I sort of thought, oh, okay, I can see how it might happen then.
Yeah.
So that's an example, I suppose, of how, I just kind of noticed a thing that I hadn't really anticipated, and then built that into a character.
Yeah, fantastic. I have a couple more questions, and then we might open up to the floor. If Emer or Jenny is here, do tell me if I'm getting close to time or something. Give me a wave, Jenny, if I've only got 5 minutes left or something like that.
1:20, so you're good.
Okay, good to go. Okay, brilliant. Sidestep. You both write really, both of characters in both of your books have really powerful experiences with cinema. May goes to the movies, and there is a sense of like a person becoming, but looking at, like, feeling. I think there's a quote in one of the books is feeling vibrant, coming out and feeling vibrant for days. How into cinema are you? How important is that kind of part of life?
Cinema. It's funny because obviously this is set in like the 60s, most of it, and then that was such a big time for American cinema and stuff. So it's like she has to go to the cinema. Like, she's obviously going to the cinema, and Mikey's taking her to see whatever, and like that was very clear to me. But like cinema was a big kind of influence on this. So yeah.
It feels like it. Were there particular movies that you were watching for mood? Could you name a few?
Well, the Conversation, the Francis Ford Coppola film, where he's like listening to the tapes and things like that. There's a film set in like the 80s called Variety by Beck Gordon. I really like that film. So yeah, they were. I was thinking about them.
Lovely couple of recommendations. Yeah. And Carmel goes to the cinema weekly, and it becomes a real serious plot point because she meets someone at the cinema. But also, how does he refer to, like, the person who comes and weeps every week or something like that?
Yeah.
Were you going to the cinema every week? Is there any?
Yeah, it was a big, as it is for her. It was like the beginning of my independence, was being able to go to the cinema on my own, and that kind of stuck with me to this day. Where, like, if I need to feel in control of my life, or like I own my life, I often go to the cinema by myself. Like, if I feel stressed emotionally or with work or something, that's sort of my go-to thing to get me out of it. And also nowadays, it's because it's like the only time I don't look at my phone for 2 hours, basically. And that is genuinely valuable thing to have access to, because I have no willpower, and I won't do it any other way, really. But it's always been. I was a bit nerdy about it as a teenager, but then I don't have a very what's the word? I think it's a little bit more of a male trait to be really categorically knowledgeable about your area of interest. You know what I mean? And like a little bit like the Nick Hornby character, like the high fidelity vibe, where you really have a kind of archival knowledge of your area of interest. And when I realized I wouldn't ever really have that with cinema, like I don't have that kind of brain about culture, I kind of stopped being so devoted to it in a way. But it's still a big pleasure of mine, I would say. Yeah.
Actually, this is kind of a nerdy, music nerdy question. But you, in a past life or a former life, you were in a band, a Waterford band, a really good Waterford band, who I think are still going, actually, in another form.
They've got an incarnation in Berlin.
You're Only Massive, they're called. or you were called. Like you, I think, because my cousin also is a musician from Waterford. That seemed like a really interesting scene and time, and wonder there'll be a brilliant book written about musicians. And I don't know, was there a wider art scene in Waterford? Like, what was it like to become an artist in Waterford at that time?
It's brilliant. Like I just can't say enough good things about specifically the arts in Waterford. Like it's very. I think as an adult now, I can say it's pretty unique feeling to me compared to any other place I've been or visit or lived in or anything, in terms of how normal it was to be really, really into art as a child. And that's just something that, I don't know, lots of my friends who were into whatever art form they liked were a bit embarrassed about it, or was a bit maybe like not masculine enough to be into books, or, you know, various things. It wasn't cool. And in Waterford, it was just completely understood that everyone loved the arts, and I can't really describe why that is, but there's like a really wonderful culture there. And yeah, I think specifically that 2008 era was like a really, really fun time to be growing up.
I think I saw you guys at an Electric Picnic.
Oh, that was our last gig, actually.
2008, maybe. Was it 2008 your last gig?
Yeah.
Yeah, but like, Katie Sunday Kim, my cousin, even like bands now like Percolator, there just seemed to be something magic in Waterford, but you don't have a clear sense of what enabled that, or...
I honestly have no idea, but I do think, I mean, obviously, I don't know if anyone says this about wherever they're from, I think like people in Waterford are the coolest people.
Not a whole, no way. Very good. Was there a similar feeling in Mullingar?
Yes. Well, we have a big music scene, you know. We have Joe Dolan, Niall Horan. Yeah, like it's good. Like I feel like the creativity of a kind of small town, like everyone's always, you know, like I did embarrassingly, like I did a lot of drama and stuff, and that was always really encouraged. And, you know, putting on like shows and things, like I really do feel like it was, like my friend now is an actress and things, and it was vital for her kind of career and stuff. So yeah, these places can't be underestimated for like their encouragement and everything. It was great.
They're brilliant.
Yeah.
Questions from the audience? Anybody prepped and ready to go? Yes.
If you wrote a book and then have to write another book, do you feel under enormous pressure? In other words, does that shadow what you write about? Because maybe you've done a book deal with one book successfully and you have to do two more.
Yeah.
Does that colour how you approach the problem?
I did feel under a little bit of pressure with this book. And every so often, like I don't really think about myself as like a writer or anything. So like, and it's quite easy after you kind of do the I don't know if you feel the same. Like it's quite easy to put yourself away and then not think of yourself as like anything when you sit down at the desk and stuff. But then occasionally, you know, you'd remember. Like I did one book and someone's waiting for the second one, but I feel only like a little bit of stress. Every so often.
Were you under any time pressure? Were you either of you under time pressure?
I was getting these emails that are like, "Hi, checking in." I was like, But apart from that, I not really.
Yeah, I think I didn't exceed my deadline because, no offense, but I think only because...
They're all going to buy your... She wrote it in the proper time. They're going to buy your book.
And genuinely, the only reason for that, I think, is because I had a very skewed idea from my journalism background that you actually definitely had to meet your deadline. And then my editor was like, nobody has ever turned it in on the day of their deadline before.
See, I had like friends that were like, oh, I didn't have mine in for 10 years.
Yeah,
like.
Yeah, exactly. So I did feel stressed, but also because I do have that background in journalism, I kind of know that I will generally meet deadlines, so I didn't panic about it. I just felt intensely stressed for a year. but yeah, I didn't worry that I wouldn't do it, basically. Yeah.
And any stress in terms of, like, you both wrote award-winning first books, right? One way or another. Was there any stress in terms of I've got to get to that level again or anything, or was it just were you focused on the project?
I don't think about the reader at all. Like, I don't think it... it's still good. Selfishly, I don't think about who's going to read the book. I really do feel like I'm only, when I'm writing, that I'm writing, like, solely for myself. So in that way, I didn't feel... like stressed, or I didn't think about anything in that way. That might prove to be a problem further down the line, but
not so far.
it's working okay.
Yeah, absolutely. What were you making?
I read some advice once that said if you're like struggling to write, then you should imagine one ideal reader that you're writing, almost like writing a letter to. So I kind of thought about my dad a lot when I was writing that, and because he's, I don't know, big Waterford man, and he's a great writer himself. And anyway, so I sort of thought about him primarily, and then I didn't think about wider perception until I'd finished it. And at that point, I got stressed for a fairly functional reason, which is that I'm considering moving to America. And as part of the application process, I was like, if I have a huge flop, it's going to not help my application. So I was a little bit worried I would get universally panned and I would be too ashamed to try and move to America afterwards. But
I doubt that's going to happen very strongly. Do we have other questions? Yes? Oh, yeah, we'll wait for the mic, sorry.
Hi, thank you for that. I was just interested in, you both have a really sort of raw and honest, I think, Megan, you said confessional quality to your first books. And I wondered what the experience of publishing that kind of, did it feel extremely exposing, or, how did it make you feel to know that that kind of work was going out into the world when you got your book deals?
I think it was slightly useful for me in that, in terms of its actual release, it happened during a lockdown, so I feel like I was a little bit protected from feeling really vulnerable during that time. A couple of people asked very strange, invasive questions, but actually mostly people were much more discreet and tactful than I thought they might have been. But I find it quite exhausting. I found it quite exhausting, and I still feel that way a little bit. Not about this book, but about the other one. To discuss it feels quite draining, I suppose, but not really sad or anything, because it was like based on feelings that I had in a time in my life that is now 10 or 15 years ago. So I kind of feel separate enough from the version of myself that I was drawing on to not feel too bad about it. Yeah.
Yeah, my first book was a collection of short stories, and short stories are not widely read, so I felt fine. But it's funny, and I don't know if you're going to have a similar experience, because my first book was all female writers, all Irish, a lot of first person as well. And I was getting a lot of questions that were like, this is you, like, this happened to you. This, even though they're very strange stories, they're like, this happened to you. And then, but this book, simply because I moved the setting to New York and I made it historical, people are, and there's lots of me in this book, but people are not asking those questions. Do you feel the same?
Yeah, and I agree. It feels like I'm getting away with it this time.
Yeah, you get totally getting away with it.
Do you think, was there something subconscious there, like that you got so many, is this autobiographical questions in the first book, you were like, I'm going to write a book set as far away in time and space as possible, or is that just completely coincidental?
I think it was coincidental, but it's been nice. Yeah.
Very good. Good little tip there. Yes? Oh, wait for the mic, please. Sorry.
And last question, please.
Last question, okay.
Hi, you spoke about finding characters, elements of characters, and then writing them into the characters of your book, like in the tabloids. And for both of you, I'm just wondering, when you're writing one book, are the characters of another book tumbling into your head, or how do you, is it all tangled up and you're trying to stop your head straying into the next book while you're writing one? Are you strict about staying with the book you're in? It must be, you must have stuff in your head all the time. Do I use it in this book, in the next book, How does that work for you?
Usually I find that, I feel like it's really impossible to talk about any of this because I've only done it twice, so I don't know. Yeah, it's hard to know what will happen in the future, but so far what's happened is that at the end of, nearing the end of writing a book, I've started to have a sense of another one and had a character, usually a character occurred to me that is totally separate from the thing I'm currently working on. And then I sort of shelve that and go, oh, lovely, that's something to look forward to when I'm finished this one. So I'll have a sense of what's next, but it doesn't really conflate with what I'm doing currently. Oh.
Is that me? Oh.
Microphones are protesting. They're working all the
Yeah, I don't. I think it's fine for me. I don't have very many ideas, and that is like someone asked me, "How do you decide what idea to do next?" I'm like, I only have one every 2 years or so. So so I'm usually just hyper focused on the idea I have, and then I have to wait even when for a while after I finish to have something new. I think. So yeah.
I was at a John Banville gig recently, and like the second question, the form of the question was like, "What do you have to say about something?" Somebody said, "I have nothing to say. I have nothing to say at all. I have nothing to say." And I thought, "Oh, geez, we've got another 55 minutes to go here." Like, but you have plenty of ideas, I'm sure, and plenty to say. So I would obviously like to thank Emer and Jenny and the festival and the team here for setting us up and putting us up and being very kind to us. Thank you all for coming, but most of all, thank you and a round of applause to Megan, Nolan, and Nicole Flattery.
Thank you.